Good afternoon, and welcome to another mini course of the Stigler Center. I'm Guy Rolnik. I'm a clinical faculty here in Booth and the co-director of the Stigler Center. As you, most of you know, today we have two very special guests at the University of Chicago, President Obama and Doug Irwin. But, so I already heard that President Obama gave a very inspiring speech this morning, but one advantage that our event is going to have over President Obama's talk is that while President Obama made a strategic decision in his talk today and probably in the next few talks that he's going to give not to mention the incumbent president, Doug will not be shy of discussing the incumbent president's policies, and I'm sure it's going to be fascinating and very relevant and up to date. So, as some of you know, at the Stigler Center, we are very much interested in the relationship between business and government, and specifically regulation and capture of regulation. And one realm of economics where there is and has been endless battles throughout the history between concentrated interest and the dispersed interest is, of course, trade and free trade. And in trade, this is probably one of the most important places where where economics and made a dramatic contribution to policy. So before we start, let me very briefly introduce Doug. So Doug is the John Sloan Dickey third century professor in the social sciences in the Department of Economics at Dartmouth College. He's the author of a new book, Clashing Over Commerce, A History of United States Trade Policy, which came out just recently at the University of Chicago Press. He's author of Free Trade Under Fire at Princeton University Press, Trade Policy Disasters, Lessons from the 30s, and many more other books and important articles. Doug is also a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research and has also served on the staff of the President's Council of Economic Advisors and the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Please.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for coming. Oops, I think you took my slides by any chance, my papers, which I'll need in just a moment. But I just want to make one quick correction that my book on the history of U.S. trade policy is coming out this fall by the University of Chicago Press. It's not quite out yet. And I'm certainly not going to hesitate to not talk about our president and his policies regarding trade. As you know, he wants to change U.S. trade policy bigly. He thinks that we're at the raw end of a deal, that he wants to get a better deal, that we've been hammered by trade, it's been a disaster for the country, and he wants to reorient U.S. trade policy. In fact, his advisor, Steve Bannon, was quoted in the New York Times just a few days ago saying that the president is maniacally focused on trade issues. And so much so that over the next few weeks, they're going to announce 2 new trade initiatives every week. So we're in for a flood of news about trade policy. Now, unfortunately, I think my message today is that there's going to be a miscalibration between some of the problems he's identified and the solutions that he's going to be offering in terms of protection or tariffs or what have you. And so that's what I sort of want to analyze. And focus mainly looking at things through the lens of economics. In some sense, the talk today and tomorrow will be sort of advertisements for courses here taught at Booth, Business 33501 and 33502. 33501 is International Commercial Policy, which is all about trade and trade policy. In fact, I'll be here at Booth teaching that this fall, if you're at all interested in that course. The other course that is relevant here is 33502, which is International Financial Policy, which gets into the macroeconomics of capital flows between countries and things of that sort. That's also a perfect complement. If you've had these two courses, you're not going to learn much today. But if you haven't, I hope I'll whet your appetite to want to go a little bit further, because these are precisely the issues that are discussed. Now, before we get into Trump and trade policy, I just want to talk about some Chicago heroes. There are a lot of heroes here at Chicago. The one I'm not going to be talking about is my former student, Kyle Hendricks, the great pitcher for the Chicago Cubs, who helped them so much last year win the World Series. He actually took my course on international trade, so he's checked that off. He's just got to win a Cy Young now, and then he'll be moving on. Now, as I said, there's a lot of heroes here at Chicago, but at the Booth School and the university more generally, we're interested in intellectual heroes. And I just want to say a word about George Stigler, after whom the Stigler Center is named. He was a great economist, and I just don't want you to forget him. I want to urge you to pick up some of his books, read his essays, because you will both be enlightened and delighted. He had a wonderful sense of humor that infused his writing. He had a very light touch, but a high level of insight as well per page of what he wrote. So definitely take a look at some of the work of George Stigler. I actually, before teaching at Dartmouth, I taught here at Chicago, and I got to know him a little bit before he unfortunately passed away in late 1991. But one thing we shared is that we are both interested in the history of economic thought, the history of economic ideas, which is not exactly a popular topic, but something he wrote about extensively and actually taught a course here at the University of Chicago. And therefore, in that spirit, because he was always one to produce calendars of economists, he always noted economists' birthdays, I just want to note one birthday. Actually, it's not a birthday, but it's an anniversary. 200 years ago last week, David Ricardo, the great economist who sort of followed in the footsteps of Adam Smith, published his book on the principles of political economy and taxation. And in that book, he had a chapter on foreign trade. And in that chapter on foreign trade, he set out for the first time an example of what comparative advantage is. I'm not going to talk about comparative advantage today. You'll have to take Econ 335.01. But what he essentially did is he used the example of wine and cloth. And he said if England specializes in producing cloth, and Portugal specializes in producing wine, there can be mutually beneficial trade between them. And it's even a little bit more sophisticated than that, this idea of comparative advantage, because it gets into labor productivity and why trade will be mutually advantageous for both England and Portugal, even though they may have very different levels of labor productivity. So once again, this idea of mutual advantage as a result of trade is something that we owe to, in part, to Ricardo from some time ago. Actually, I'll just mention about this wine. This is actually not Portuguese wine. I didn't want to bring that on the airline. But this is actually wine called laissez-faire, which is also somewhat appropriate for Chicago. Laissez-faire may sometimes be a good economic policy. However, laissez-faire is a very bad policy if you want to make good wine. Because this is actually awful wine. I thought about, just because of this, I'm going to have to buy a case of it. But after sipping it, I said, I think I'll just take a sip, pour it out, keep the bottle, not buy any wine. Actually, it's made in Maine, of all places. Not exactly the right climatic conditions for growing wine. In fact, that's one reason why Ricardo said England should not specialize in the production of wine, because even though it could do it, it would not do it very well, and therefore it should rely on climatic conditions elsewhere. Okay, so that's the idea that there's going to be mutual benefit as a result of trade. Well, our president has stated, has sort of a different view of trade. Not this mutual benefit idea, but it's sort of very one-sided. In fact, we're losing as a result of trade. China's killing us, Japan's killing us, Mexico's killing us. We have incompetent people negotiating these trade agreements. We're losing money at every step. We don't make any good deals. We need to refocus U.S. trade policy. And this zero-sum sort of thinking also permeated his inaugural address, where he talked about the factories that had been shut down, the workers that had been laid off. This middle quote here sort of gets at this sort of zero-sum view of things, where other countries gain at the U.S. expense. So the wealth of our middle class has been ripped from their homes and redistributed across the entire world. If you've taken some courses here, you might realize that China has grown rich not because they're ripping us off, but they've increased their labor productivity in so many sectors. It's not a zero-sum game in which they're getting rich, we're getting poorer. And then here's where he gets to his policy prescriptions, that we have to protect our borders from the ravages of other countries, making our products, stealing our companies, destroying our jobs. Protection will lead to great prosperity and strength. In my forthcoming book, I talk about the history of U.S. with experience under protection, and I would dissent from that statement there that'll make us great again, but that's something we can get into a little bit later. He also talked not just about protection, but how there's carnage. You might remember that word carnage that came up in the address, which is very unusual for an incoming president to talk about, and that led even former President George W. Bush to say that was pretty odd stuff coming out in that inaugural address. Usually don't speak about carnage so much and how utterly bereft we are of any economic growth. But of course, it's not just the president himself. Steve Bannon, one of his advisors I mentioned before, is sort of a self-proclaimed economic nationalist. The globalists have gutted the American working class and created the middle class nation. So once again, the sense that we've lost out, other countries have gained, and it's through trade that they've sort of sucked our wealth out of our country. And I won't mention that last quote there, but that's sort of his view of things. And he's not the only economic advisor that sort of takes this hard line, economic nationalist line. Peter Navarro, former business school professor at the UC Irvine, is now head of the National Trade Council, and he talks about how China's conquest has sort of vaporized the middle class, driven down wages, and he actually produced this movie about 10 years ago called Death by China, with the stake being driven into the heart of America, how they've just really killed America. You can watch that free on YouTube. So if you have any interest, actually you only have to watch the first 5 or 10 minutes, and that seems to repeat the theme. You'll sort of get the idea of it. But if you want an hour and a half of it, it's certainly up there for you to watch. At any rate, so U.S. trade policy is up for some big changes. If you looked at the website of the U.S. Trade Representative's Office in Washington, right after the inauguration, they flipped, of course, the new administration. And this is what they say: an America First trade policy. We're going to put American workers first, American jobs first, the American middle class first. And we're going to do so through some certain policies. So what exactly are those policies? What were the pledges that the president promised to make? Well, here are some big ones. And so there's just sort of a laundry list we'll go through, and then we'll sort of analyze sort of the economic thinking behind them. So pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So that was going to be President Obama's, one of his big foreign economic legacies in terms of foreign economic policy. Day one, he said he would declare China a currency manipulator. He promised to renegotiate NAFTA and the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, and if they did not renegotiate on terms that were more advantageous to us, we would pull out. And that's a threat he just reiterated over the weekend in an interview with the Associated Press, where he said, if we don't get a good deal, we will pull out of NAFTA. Impose a border tax of varying percent on various countries. Enforce the fair trade laws more, which means something known as anti-dumping duties. We're going to stop foreign companies from dumping their products in the U.S. market. Strengthen Buy America provisions, and abolish the Export-Import Bank. Well, he's accomplished more than any other president in his first 100 days. So he's already sort of moved down this list. He tells us so. What has he done? Well, first of all, the first one, check. He has pulled us out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, so that will not be going forward. Declare China a currency manipulator. Well, he didn't do that his first day. Didn't do it his first month. In fact, he just recently said, the Treasury Department reported that they're not going to declare China a currency manipulator. And he, when confronted with the press, well, that's what you said you were going to do. He said, well, why would I do that when they're cooperating with us to contain North Korea? So now he's beginning to see that some of these issues are being linked across, from economic policy to foreign policy. And so China will not be declared a currency manipulator. Certainly, we're going ahead with the renegotiation of NAFTA. The border tax issue is involved in tax reform on Capitol Hill, so that's still up in the air. There's going to be, I'm sure, some big movements in terms of specific trade cases that will be imposing anti-dumping and what's known as countervailing duties on imports. So this week, I think we're expecting an announcement that we're going to be imposing duties against softwood lumber from Canada. And I'm sure some other duties will be imposed on Chinese steel imports and aluminum imports. And strengthen Buy America provisions, which he is putting into various pieces of legislation, he hopes. And he's also backed off his promise to abolish the Export-Import Bank, which provides financial support for U.S. exporters. So there's some adjustments here, but the general thrust that we're going to be taking a much more aggressive stance against other countries remains in place. So here's sort of the way I want to approach it. I want to ask a couple questions about the diagnosis that's implicit in the Trump trade policy as it's promised. Is trade, in fact, hurting the U.S. economy? Are trade deficits a bad thing? Have trade agreements been a bad deal for the United States? I won't get through all these today, so it'll spill over tomorrow to some extent. And tomorrow in particular, I'll talk about the potential cures. Will raising tariffs help the U.S. economy? Will renegotiated trade agreements give us a better deal? What does it mean to get a better deal in terms of these trade agreements? And will Buy America and some of these other policies work? Okay, so first question, has trade hurt the U.S. economy? So here's just a plot of exports and imports as a share of U.S. GDP going back to 1960. And what you can see is that there's been that's globalization to some extent. Trade forms a larger part of the U.S. economy than it did in the past. There's a big run-up in trade in the 1990s and the 2000s in particular. And since the financial crisis, when you can see the red line there, which is imports, which fell off quite a bit, trade has tailed off a bit. Both exports, actually imports as well. But the question is this trade, which in fact is a two-way street? We export a lot of stuff, we import a lot of stuff. I'll talk about the gap in a moment. We export Boeing aircraft, we export General Electric engines and motors and machinery. We export soybeans and corn and wheat. We export a lot of manufactured goods and agricultural goods. We also import a lot of goods. We import most of the clothing we're wearing, apparel, most of our footwear. We import winter vegetables. We also import steel and some aircraft and other things that will compete directly with domestic producers. One thing to keep in mind, because we're always sensitive to this issue of trade and jobs, is behind every export, there is jobs. There are jobs. That's U.S. production that's being sold abroad. Not every import takes away from U.S. jobs, because a lot of the imports are not produced here in the United States. So, for example, we import a lot of tin. We import winter vegetables. We import bananas. We don't produce these things domestically, and so those imports don't necessarily mean that we're losing jobs as a result of those imports. Of course, those are not the sensitive ones. It's the ones that are directly rubbing against domestic producers that where the political controversy is. So that's sort of the state of trade. Jobs are created by exports. Some jobs are lost as a result of imports. We'll get to that in a moment. The question is, has this destroyed the middle class? Are we losing the middle class? Well, this is a graphic from the New York Times, and it looks, yes, in fact, the share of households in the middle of the income distribution between $35,000 and $100,000 in terms of household income, that has been shrinking since the early 1970s, late 1960s. So the middle class has been shrinking. But what you don't see here is, well, where are the people shifting to? Turns out many more people are moving into households where there is higher income, over 100,000. So that's gone from 7 to 25% up until about 2000. The number of people in lower income households, that's been flat to declining over this period. So the middle class has been shrinking, but generally over the past few decades, we've become richer as a society overall. Now, the big caveat here, of course, is since 2000, and in particular since the 2008 financial crisis, the economy has not been performing up to our historical standard. And so that's why we see a decline in some high-income households and a slight rise there in lower-income households. So this is sort of the backdrop to what I think has been behind a lot of the support for President Trump in the election, is that there has been some disturbing trends in the U.S. economy since the financial crisis. The question is, are they really related to trade? Well, just to go back for a moment, trade's actually sort of fallen off since the financial crisis. So it's not as though there's some recent surge of imports that's causing destruction and problems for the U.S. economy. If anything, there may be a historical legacy of what has happened in the past. So that's just in terms of income distribution. The middle class has shrunk, but generally we are richer as a society overall, even if that doesn't apply to all households. I should just note my colleague at Dartmouth, Bruce Sacerdote, has a recent paper that's gotten a little bit of attention about looking at consumption in the United States, and shows that that the deflators that used to show how real purchasing power of income is not as high as nominal income, actually show much greater consumption growth, even in lower income households, than a lot of those metrics. So there's a lot of measurement issues here as well. Now, what about manufacturing jobs? Because that's one thing that the president has spoken quite a bit about. This is just the share of the labor force in manufacturing, and it's been under continuous secular decline since 1950 or so. Some of the courses here, I'm sure, get into exactly why this is taking place. What's happening in manufacturing, in some sense, is what happened in agriculture over the past 100 or 150 years or so. That is, we're devoting less of our labor force to agriculture because we're not producing fewer agricultural crops. We can produce more crops with fewer people. The same thing with manufacturing. We're still producing a lot of manufactured goods. We just need to devote a smaller share of our labor force to manufacturing to keep up that output, and I'll show you that in just a moment. So we have really shifted to a service sector economy, and this is just part of that. Now, how much is trade driving this phenomenon? Well, when we look at NAFTA, for example, which was a relatively small shock overall to the U.S. economy, that comes very late in the game, and it doesn't alter the trend here. We're already on this path towards having fewer jobs in manufacturing. I put China there, too, because China joined the WTO in the year 2000, but what's interesting is that our policy vis-a-vis Chinese imports did not change at all when they joined the WTO, because we had already given them what's known as most favored nation trading status in the U.S. market since 1980. So our policy with regard to China did not change in 2000, but that's commonly dated as when China becomes a big player in world markets. Our tariffs did not go down on Chinese goods at that time. Some economists said, well, we resolved uncertainty about whether they would continue to get their access to the U.S. market at this time, and that accounts for some of the surge in imports. But certainly that you can't really see much of a change in the trend as a result of China's entry into the WTO. Okay, so I said that a lot of the job loss in manufacturing is really because of productivity developments. In fact, there's been some decomposition analysis done showing that most job loss in manufacturers is due to increased productivity, about 85%, as opposed to import competition. So we have to really think about what's going on in the manufacturing sector in terms of productivity, and I think the motor vehicle sector is a great example of this. So here we have the red line, which is production of motor vehicles and parts, starting in 1990, and the blue line is employment in the motor vehicles and parts industry. And what we can see is that obviously the 2008-2009 crisis and recession were a huge blow to the auto industry, but production's come back and higher than it was before. Now, employment has not come back, so output has been up about 20% from the pre-recession peak, but employment is down about 10%. So we've shed jobs even though we're producing more and more cars. And that's not too hard to understand because this is the way cars used to be built. It was a very labor-intensive product, employed a lot of blue-collar labor, and this is not the way manufacturing is done today. It's become much more of a high-technology, higher productivity sector and industry. We need many more white-collar technicians and engineers and computer scientists rather than blue-collar workers. And so this is an exaggeration. I think this is a German plant where you literally see no workers, but we just need many fewer workers in most manufacturing industries today because of advances in technology. And so what this implies is that, well, we might be able to bring some more jobs back if we had higher tariffs on steel or on cars or something. Well, there's an important trade-off that I'll bring up momentarily. But you're not necessarily going to bring back a lot of jobs because the production will be shifted towards much more capital-intensive, technology-intensive production techniques. So a book that I'm actually reading right now, you might have heard of it, Janesville. Does anyone know where Janesville is? Wisconsin. It's actually just north of Rockport or Rockville. So it's not too far from here.
Paul Ryan.
Exactly. It's Paul Ryan's district, though there's a GM plant there. And it shut down as a result of the Great Recession, and it didn't come back. And there's a story about how that town has tried to adjust to this huge shock that afflicted it. I'm just into it, so it's quite interesting so far. But a couple interesting points. First of all, what really hurt Janesville was the recession and the financial crisis. Second of all, when GM shut down that plant, they didn't move it to Mexico. They didn't move it to China. They ramped up production in Texas. And they offered those workers their jobs if they would be willing to move to Texas. Some did and some didn't. So there's a lot of relocation of manufacturing production within the United States. It's not all foreign competition. It's technology and a lot of jobs moving to the south. That's particularly important for the Chicago area because if you go through northern Indiana, other parts of Illinois, a lot of towns have been very hard hit, but a lot of those jobs are not going overseas. They're going down to Alabama, Tennessee, and elsewhere in the United States. Okay, so A lot of jobs shifting within the United States, jobs being lost to technology. There are certain sectors where we have lost jobs as a result of foreign competition. So this is just a plot of changes in output versus changes of employment. And we can see for some big sectors there, employment has gone down in terms of production employment, but output has gone up. Well, that's productivity. A couple sectors down there in the lower left where both output and employment have gone down: apparel, textiles, and furniture. Those are precisely the sectors that have been most hit by imports from China and other Asian countries. Those are the sectors that, in some sense, are most sensitive to foreign competition. In other cases, blocking imports is really not going to achieve much because we're producing more just with fewer workers. And the last thing I'll say about labor markets is that there's a big issue with the labor force participation rate. Once again, this predates a lot of the big increases in imports that we saw in the 1990s and 2000s. But it is a big societal challenge for the United States. But once again, these are pre-existing trends, and it's not at all obvious that changes in trade policy are going to help increase labor force participation at all. It's sort of a separate issue. So I want to shift now back to trade policy and talk about the trade deficit. So I mentioned earlier that Steve Bannon mentioned that the president is going to be maniacally focused on trade. He's really maniacally focused on the trade deficit. That's the big thing that he thinks is a problem. He doesn't like this word free trade. What is free trade when a country has an imbalance of hundreds of billions of dollars? And he sort of said this, he brings this up quite a bit, that we're losing money as a result of this trade deficit. We're not exporting enough. Other countries are not buying enough of our products because of foreign unfair trade practices. We're importing too much, and it's devastated some of our workers. So when he talks about fair trade, when he talks about changing U.S. trade policy, I think what he's really trying to get at is he wants more balanced trade. So this raises a couple questions. One, is a trade deficit inherently a bad thing? And certainly we should try to understand it before we try to correct it if that's our policy objective. And second of all, are the policies being proposed by the Trump administration going to increase or decrease the trade deficit? Now, they want it decreased, but there's some indications that the policies that pursue will actually increase the trade deficit, and you'll be fighting at cross purposes. So this is really an issue for 335.02, International Financial Policy. You'll get into this a lot. So this is the trade deficit. This is the current account balance as a share of U.S. GDP. And what you can see is that it increased quite a bit in the 1980s, then receded, increased quite a bit in the 1990s, the mid-2000s, and then receded particularly with the crisis. Once again, since 2009, the U.S. trade deficit has not been growing. It's been pretty flat at about 2.5% of GDP. So in some sense, he may be speaking about quote-unquote problems from the past when the trade deficit was quite big, growing to about almost 6% of GDP. So imports are not surging in now, but he views this trade deficit as still being a big problem. And so what he's done is he issued an executive order a while ago that we need to study. We need to study this and find out which countries are we running this trade deficit with and outline some possible policy solutions to it. Well, in my view, this study is completely unnecessary. We already know what's causing it. You'd learn it in 335.02. It's basic Econ 101. It's not a mystery. A lot of the data is out there in terms of if you want to identify particular countries. So we don't need the study. And particularly, here's what's going to be frustrating about this study. This just appeared this morning in Inside U.S. Trade, which is sort of a newsletter about U.S. trade policy. Criteria for trade deficit study may prevent it from analyzing why the deficit exists. Well, it's really hard to come up with policy solutions to what you think is a problem if you're not willing to understand why the trade deficit exists in the first place. Essentially, what he wants is to identify which countries the U.S. has big trade deficits with, and then go after them. Renegotiating trade deals, higher tariffs, things of that sort. And, well, let's step back. Since, we're an academic institution, why do we have the trade deficit? So this is Econ 101. You probably get this in macroeconomics. You'll get this in international financial policy. A country's trade balance, its aggregate trade balance, is just the difference between its spending, its income, and its spending. If you spend more as a country than your income, that's the first equation right there. It's not even an equation. You are going to have a trade deficit. If your income is greater than your spending, you're going to have a trade surplus. So what does that mean? Well, why does Japan, China, Germany have trade surpluses? Well, they're high savings, low spending countries. So they run a trade surplus with the rest of the world. Why is it the United States has run pretty consistent trade deficits for 30, 40 years? We are a low saving, high consumption economy. What is the policy implication? If we really want to reduce the trade deficit, we should not reduce our income at all, but we should reduce our spending and increase our savings. And yet that's something that most politicians don't want to tell Americans to do, to reduce their consumption and increase their savings. One way to start would be for the government to balance its books, because when the government runs a fiscal deficit, that's a net drain on U.S. savings. Germany has a fiscal surplus, and they have a trade surplus. Those two are correlated. The United States has had fiscal deficits and trade deficits for some time. Now, what about this idea that we're losing money as a country as a result of the trade deficit? Well, that's the second line there. Current account deficit is equal to the capital account surplus. Now, what does that mean? So I brought with me a friend of mine, Alexander Hamilton, first Treasury Secretary, star on Broadway. He's going to help me explain the second point right here and why we're not losing money as a result of the trade deficit. So I have this $10 here. Let's say I go to China and I buy $10 worth of clothing. We now have a $10 trade deficit. They have this $10. They haven't bought anything from the U.S. yet. We have a $10 trade deficit. If China spent this $10 back in the United States, what happens to the trade deficit? It's gone. Okay? China's not doing that. They're taking some of this $10 that they have. First of all, they can't use this in China. They can't pay their workers in dollars. They can't pay off debts in terms of the firms in dollars. That's not their currency. So what are they going to do with this thing? They're going to use some of this to buy U.S. good. To the extent that they buy U.S. goods, that's a U.S. export. Okay, and that narrows that $10 trade deficit. What they're really doing with a lot of this money, however, is investing it in the United States. They're buying U.S. Treasury bills. They built up their foreign exchange reserves to a huge amount. They're buying U.S. companies. They're buying U.S. stock. They're buying some of U.S. farmland. They're using this dollar, spending it in the United States, and that's what that capital account surplus means. To the extent that they're not buying U.S. goods to make the current account or the trade balance zero, we're going to have a trade account deficit, but a capital account surplus to the extent they're investing in the United States in terms of buying our Treasury bills or buying U.S. companies or things of that sort. So that we're not losing money. The money's coming back. It's just coming back in a different form. It's not buying U.S. goods, it's buying U.S. assets. So the money is coming back. Now, we may not like that, or it's helping us finance our fiscal deficit at a lower interest rate than we otherwise would be, so we don't want to forget that. But if we want to change that, there are other policies besides tariffs that can help account for that. So the bottom line here is that trade balance is a macroeconomic phenomenon. The trade balance is not determined by trade policies. It doesn't matter whether China's an open or closed economy. What matters is which way the financing or the capital is flowing between countries. Bilateral trade balances are meaningless. I'll come back to that in a moment. So, what are the implications here for policy? Well, let's think about, since line number one there, macroeconomic policy. The president announced over the weekend, I believe, or late last week, he was going to announce a massive tax cut this week. I think on Wednesday they're planning to announce a massive tax cut, which caught his Treasury advisors by surprise, but it's going to be announced. And the Secretary of Commerce also said there's going to be a massive increase in defense spending. Well, what is that going to do to the fiscal balance of the United States? Big tax cut, big ramp up in spending. It's likely that the fiscal deficit will increase as a result of that. Now, they said that tax cut will pay for itself. That's what the Secretary of Treasury Mnuchin said. Remains to be seen. But if we have a big increase in the fiscal, if we have a fiscal blowout, what that means is our spending is going to go up there. It's not necessarily going to raise national income. The trade balance is going to get larger. We'll have a larger trade deficit. That's exactly what happened in the 1980s when President Reagan came in, cut taxes, raised defense spending, fiscal deficit grew, the trade deficit grew, as that chart showed you just previously. So in all likelihood, you could go after foreign unfair trade practices all you want. You could block access to the U.S. market all you want. But that first line there, if you increase spending dramatically, you're going to have a larger trade deficit at the end of the day, and the Trump administration is going to be very frustrated with what comes about. Now, here's just a quick chart from the Wall Street Journal, a scatter plot of tariffs and current account surpluses or deficits or trade deficits. And what they say and what all economists say is basically there's no relationship between the two. Just one example of that, Mexico. Pre-NAFTA, Mexico had a pretty closed market. and they had a trade deficit. They weren't running trade surplus as a result of the keeping out imports. After NAFTA, when they opened up their market, now they're running a trade surplus. What's going on here? It doesn't have to do with open or closed markets. What it has to do is which way capital is flowing between countries. That's really what's going on. You have to take 335.02 once again to get into more detail on that. Whoops, what did I do? Here we go. We're almost there, because I do want to get to your questions. This whole point about the current account of the trade deficit being caused by the gap between income and spending, if you want to I can obviously just speak on it very briefly. If you want to get a very good one-page op-ed on exactly this topic, done last week by Columbia University economist Jeff Sykes, is exactly this. And he says, will economic illiteracy trigger a trade war? And you just have to look at the first paragraph there where he says, they claim America's current account deficit or trade deficit is in fact, which is in fact a result of America's low and falling savings rate, is an indicator of unfair trade practices by Germany and China, two current account surplus countries. Their embrace of economic ignorance could lead to disaster. What he's saying is that if we start a trade war, if we start raising trade barriers in this elusive quest to reduce the trade deficit, when we don't worry about our savings rate, when we don't worry about the fiscal deficit, we'll start a trade war, we won't close the trade gap, and will just cause a lot of problems for the world economy. But anyway, that's an excellent article. I highly recommend it. You can find it on Google very easily. Let me just say one word about that. That's talking about the aggregate trade deficit. I could also speak about why bilateral trade deficits are meaningless. I run a massive trade deficit with my grocery store. They don't buy a thing from me, and I'm always in there spending money. Most of you are MBA students. Are you running a big trade surplus or trade deficit with the rest of the economy? I think you know what you're running a massive trade deficit. Now, why are you doing that? It's not necessarily a bad thing. You're investing in your future. You hope your future income will be higher as a result of that, but currently you're running a trade deficit. Bilateral trade deficits are absolutely meaningless. We don't want to have bilateral trade balance with our grocer, with our barber, with the University of Chicago. Don't count on them hiring you and balancing that account. You may have to go earn income elsewhere to pay off debts you've incurred. So bilateral trade balances are meaningless. In fact, the bilateral trade statistics are not completely meaningless, but largely meaningless. And I'll just use one example to illustrate that, and that's the iPhone. So how many people here have an iPhone? Just about everyone. Okay, so not many Android users, I guess. But if you look at the back of your iPhone, of course, what does it say? Designed in the United States, or designed in California, actually. Does it say, where does it say it's manufactured? It doesn't say where it's manufactured. It says assembled in China. Assembled. Why? Because it's actually manufactured all over the world. It is not a Chinese product. You know, the memory, the camera, the flash drive, the screen, these are produced in Germany, Japan, Korea, the United States. All these parts get sent to China for assembly, because labor is inexpensive there. It's packaged there and then sent to the United States. Now, what do U.S. trade statistics do? Well, when a freighter comes in, it's probably shipped in by air into the United States with all these iPhones. They say, where did this come from? China. Okay. Each iPhone, the unit value is $178. Of course, you probably paid a little bit more. That's the Apple cost. That's the import value, all attributed to China. We're attributing all $178 to China. Now, did it really come from China? Actually, of that $178, how much is really coming from China? It's about $5 or $10, because it's the labor assembly at the end. But the statistics don't indicate that, so we're magnifying our trade deficit with China by attributing all these goods that aren't really made in China, but their last point of stoppage in terms of production was in China. Therefore, so just this, what it says is, the traditional approach would say we have this $2 billion trade deficit with China just on the iPhone alone, but the value-added approach looks at where's the components actually coming from. We actually have a trade surplus with China because we're exporting more content, physical hard content, not just the intellectual content, which is Apple's markup over that 178. We're exporting components to China that exceed in value the labor it takes to put it together. Now, we have a larger trade deficit with Japan, Germany, and South Korea because they're German, South Korean, Japanese components in the iPhone that we're attributing to China, not to those countries itself. So the bilateral trade balances are absolutely meaningless. Unfortunately, what this means is that if you engage in a study of looking at all of these bilateral trade deficits, and then you want to whack the countries with which the United States has a big trade deficit, you may be hitting the wrong countries. And so, there will be a study produced by the Trump administration on trade deficits, but I think we already know what it's going to say, and B, we already, at least in my view, it's going to be pretty useless in terms of a guide for U.S. policy going forward. So I want to get to your question. So what's the bottom line? Is we in the United States, we do have economic problems, particularly in our labor market. Largely, these are factors independent of trade. Not for all sectors. We've lost a lot of apparel jobs and furniture jobs as a result of imports. That's giving consumers a good deal. I haven't said a thing about consumers. We'll talk about them tomorrow. But it does cause dislocation in certain industries, in certain sectors, in certain states, and that's a problem that we have to deal with. But trade is not killing the United States. There are a lot of benefits from trade that I'll talk about tomorrow. And in particular, trade protectionism is not a cure for the trade deficit because it's not going to affect that savings balance that Sykes and so many other economists point to in terms of what's driving U.S. trade deficits. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that actually, most Americans are pretty optimistic about foreign trade. If you listen to that inaugural address and listen to all the statements coming from the administration how trade is destroying us, this is just a Gallup poll that goes back more than 20 years on whether Americans think that trade is an opportunity for future growth or a threat to the U.S. economy. And since about 2011 or so, the green line, light green line, which is going up, 72% of Americans see trade as an opportunity for the United States. Only 23% think it's a major threat. So I think there's a mismatch here between the priorities of the administration in terms of what they're going to be acting upon and even where a lot of the American people think are priorities. And so I'll leave it there and look forward to your questions. So we have 2 microphones set up there. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Yeah.
So you talked about trade at aggregate level. So, but if in case trade is happening, could it lead to regional inequalities in terms of, for example, the Great Lakes region losing out jobs and California gaining it? So that 72% is basically most Californians being happy with trade.
Well, I'm sure if you went to Janesville, once again, they lost the jobs to Texas, not to another country, but I think they'd have a very different view of structural adjustment and some of the problems. If you go to a lot of the smaller towns in the Carolinas, actually South Carolina is a fascinating state because there are certain communities that have been utterly devastated when the textile plant closes or the furniture factory closes. But then that's where BMW is invested, a lot of foreign automakers are invested, and there's a lot of manufacturing going on there. So absolutely. And so what that points to is that mobility is very important. I think that's something the Stigler Center has done some work on, potentially, about how do we get workers moving to regions of the economy that are booming. And it's a well-documented fact that Americans are moving much less now than we did in previous generations. And if people are not willing to move to where there are new economic opportunities, A, that's sort of a problem, and B, it indicates that maybe we ought to bring, have reinvestment zones or something like that to bring capital investments and have tax holidays or what have you to get capital to where the people are if the people are not willing to move. Yeah?
I have a question. So I think much of what you said today will not convince Trump, and especially not Bannon, because I've spent some time listening to some of Bannon's old speeches, and his main concern is that the world has become a more interdependent place, and because of that, the U.S. has less of an ability to assert its authority in the international arena. So in his vision, the U.S. should become a kind of autarkic, self-sufficient state with a trade surplus, and that would then enable the U.S. to assert its authority in the international arena. In his vision, he wants to sort of undo the post-1945 global order.
First of all, I'd agree with you that I wouldn't convince them. And second of all, I think actually a U.S. retreat from international engagement would harm our ability to affect world events. And and this is something I'll speak about tomorrow. And I think we see that with TPP already. How a big winner from us withdrawing from TPP is China, because now the U.S. is not going to be engaged in terms of setting trade arrangements for the 21st century in the Asia-Pacific region. So the more autarkic, withdrawn U.S. will have less power in terms of the world economy and world politics more generally. And I think will harm things. Once again, this is some things I'll be saying tomorrow, but if you look at how we've alienated Mexico, and once again, we haven't done anything with regard to Mexico yet, but just all the bad-mouthing and the threats have really changed the tenor of the debate in Mexico. And this is a neighboring country that's very important to us, not just economically, but politically. We have all sorts of a security relationship with Mexico, diplomatic relations. We're affecting their domestic politics in terms of giving rise to anti-American politicians down there who want to strike back at the U.S. if we're going to strike at them. So we're alienating a lot of potential allies through this approach. I'll leave that for tomorrow. But I agree, I don't think I'd convince them at all.
So my question is, given that the focus of the U.S. administration seems to be on the trade deficit, what do you expect that the trade renegotiations that are already taking place are going to look like when they conclude?
I'll talk about this a little bit tomorrow, but just give you a little bit of a preview. Once again, we've withdrawn from TPP, but they've also said, no, we want trade agreements, we just want bilateral. So we're going to replace the TPP with 12 bilateral agreements with all of the TPP partners. So that leaves a lot of economists scratching their heads. What can you possibly get in a bilateral agreement that you can't get in a plurilateral or a regional agreement? And it turns out there's a lot of trading that can take place in a regional setting that can't take place in a bilateral setting. So it's not clear what a better deal would you'd get from bilateral agreements. There have been some leaks about some of the items that they want to specifically focus on in the NAFTA negotiations, and I think what's striking to most economists looking at that is how there's nothing there. It's like tweaking little things. He says NAFTA is a disaster, but they're not going to rip up the whole thing. They're just going to change some rules of origin and a few other provisions. That's nothing compared to the inflated rhetoric about the damage it's caused. So I think they're going to be bumping up against the reality, a couple of realities. One is that, other countries, it's going to be really hard to negotiate with countries that you're sort of alienating with harsh rhetoric. And B, actually these trade agreements, they cut tariffs to zero on both sides. There's not too much more you can push other countries to do. And in particular, sort of amusing, if not, sort of sad point is that in some of the talking points, once again, have been leaked on this because we don't know fully what their plans are. There's something called Buy America provisions, where the federal government can, when it undertakes some stimulus project or some investment project, they have to buy American steel or what have you. We want to preserve those, but we want to eliminate the Buy Canada policies in Canada, Buy Mexico policies in Mexico. So it's not good for other countries. We don't want that, but it's okay for us. And you're just not going to have a good negotiation if you say the rules that apply to you won't apply to us. So I think they're going to find it very difficult to undertake some of these negotiations.
Some of the criticism against the trade agreement do not come from anti-trade people, but from free trade people that say that a lot of the rules in those trade agreements actually benefit special interests and are not benefiting trade.
Yep. There's a critique that is sort of a more refined critique in some sense than just sort of the anti-trade. There is something to that. In any trade agreement, they're going to be very complex. They're talking about very particular sectors. I think at the end of the day, however, we are talking about, well, there are two things. One is when you're talking about reducing trade barriers. Those, I think, are pro-competitive because you may help out certain firms that are special interests that have certainly wanted the government to do that, but you're reducing government impediments to the free flow of goods. That's a good thing. When you get into regulatory changes, either financial regulations or health and safety regulations or things of that sort, then you have to almost look at it on a case-by-case basis. And there's special interests behind even free trade agreements. It doesn't mean it's bad for consumers in both countries, but even though it's driven by special interest politics. So you really have to look at what those things are. So the Cato Institute did an exhaustive study of the TPP, sort of looking at exactly that issue. Is it being driven by special interests, or is it really going to be pro-consumer, pro-market, pro-competition? And they came out saying it's a net positive. So sort of the world we live in is one of these trade agreements if we want to move forward. And you're going to have to take some good with the bad, as opposed to a sort of a purist approach. But there are certainly they should be watched very carefully in terms of what are in these provisions.
but you know, for places like Janesville, like what would you recommend as like a good way of mitigating some of the harm that does happen in a maybe on a regional basis, you know, and not aggregate?
Well, I think we need special policies for those communities that, so there's a big difference between cities where if one plant goes down, there's a lot of other economic opportunities for some of these smaller towns like Janesville where you have a big GM plant and if that goes down, it's utterly devastating. So then obviously you want to have financial assistance for those workers to potentially move, to relocate, to acquire new skills if they possibly can. That's going to be an unsatisfactory answer for someone who's 50 years old or 60 years old who've spent their time with the whole company. You might want to bring investment back into those communities in some particular way. Obviously, portability of health insurance and things of that sort. Anything that will allow people to keep their Social Security, not their health security, if they move to some other place. It's going to be a very imperfect patchwork of policies. But I think what's happened is I think this is where the Trump administration has been right, and Trump was right on the campaign trail, is that a lot of these communities have been sort of left behind, ignored by federal policy, and that creates a lot of difficulties for the economy, let alone these communities. I will say, however, that the Rust Belt states have not helped themselves with high taxes, rigid labor laws, and a policy that was sort of anti-business because they assumed that these big steel firms or big auto firms would always be there and they could be milked in terms of tax revenue and things of that sort. So if you look at what the southern states are doing in terms of attracting not just domestic investment from the north, but foreign investment. When BMW is thinking about coming in with a plant, they're looking at Illinois versus South Carolina. What is it that South Carolina is doing that Illinois is not doing, or Indiana, or what have you? And I think that a hard look at some of the state-level policies in the Rust Belt, they're not good for positioning themselves to attract new investment. So I think things have to be done at the state level as well.
We've heard obviously a lot about banning China currency manipulator, which may or may not happen. But could you speak more broadly to the issue of countries undervaluing their currency to aid their exports and reduce imports? And one, is it happening that you know of? And two, how does that impact the framework that you sort of gave us to analyze free trade?
So that did happen a bit, particularly with China in terms of the period from 2000 to 2008 or so, before the financial crisis. What they're doing is basically the central bank was buying up a lot of these dollars to accumulate dollar reserves. They went from $300 or $400 million to almost $4 trillion within the span of 10 or 15 years. That kept the value of their currency artificially low and did promote exports. Economists debate about how big an effect that was, but certainly was the case. And I think there's a rethinking on how much the United States or the IMF should be allowing other countries to rapidly accumulate dollar reserves to the extent that it gives them an export advantage. There's a book coming out from the Peterson Institute for International Economics exactly on this topic. I don't think it's a major issue right now. And certainly it's not the case, the president's right. China is manipulating its currency now, but it's propping it up. It's not trying to keep it artificially low. So it's spending its reserves, trying to keep its currency from depreciating further. That's manipulation, but not in the right way in terms of trade surpluses and trade deficits. But once again, I think it's not an issue now, but it was an issue during that period, and that's something that can be raised.
So the job losses on certain communities, manufacturing, trying to show places like Janesville seem to take some economists by surprise. I didn't hear much about this prior to the election. I heard plenty after the election, but maybe that's hindsight. I guess my question is, what is the lesson for the academic community in that?
Actually, there's some work done here by Eric Hurst and others on why is it that economists and others didn't really notice that there were a lot of manufacturing jobs being lost prior to the financial crisis, and once again, the 2000-2008 period. What else was going on in the U.S. economy during that period? We had a housing bubble. And so the unemployment rate was actually falling during that period. So you can have a lot of churning and dislocation at a very local level, and the aggregate unemployment numbers are coming down. because, once again, construction jobs were being created, other jobs were creating other sectors. Now, after the financial crisis, this is where things have sort of been exposed. Manufacturing is not coming back in terms of number of jobs because it's so technologically intensive. We don't have nearly as many construction workers as we did before because we don't have a construction housing boom. And so the jobs for the blue-collar workers have sort of, not really recovered since that period there. So, in other words, the big losses in manufacturing in the 2000s were masked by the increases in employment in construction and other sectors. So the lesson is I think that, first of all, the best thing that we can do for workers of all types is have a robust growing economy. And so that means we have to be very careful about recessions in the future, financial crises. It's called macroprudential regulation. Avoiding big downturns is key. Then you get back to sort of specific state and local policies or helping workers who are in these sectors. Once again, we'll talk about this a bit more tomorrow. Trade policy is really not going to help very much. If we're putting in robots in auto factories, banning foreign imports of automobiles, banning or imposing high tariffs on apparel products, it's not going to bring those jobs back to the U.S. So that's sort of this false solution. The solution, I think, is to either not retraining necessarily, but trying to move people into other sectors or other regions of the country that are doing well. And once again, different people can be positioned. So one of the things I show in my class is a town in Pennsylvania where they lose the textile mill. The workers from age 45 and under do pretty well. They can retrain to become nurses, move into the service sector, do something else. It's worthwhile for them to take 1 or 2 years with government assistance to retrain. But if you're talking about a 55 or 60-year-old worker, they don't have the time horizon to retrain for another job. That's where the big problem is, and that's where I think we should be focusing more on.
What accounts for the current decline in both exports and imports? And do you see this as a trend or just a blip?
That's been a big question for economists because if you look at the growth rate of world trade, it's at a very low level compared to the historic norm over the past 40 or 50 years or so. I think part of it is just natural that the world economy is not growing very robustly. I think it's partly that the rapid growth in the past was due to China growing rapidly and becoming part of the world trading system. Look at what Americans are consuming now more. It's more non-traded goods. It's more entertainment. It's less material things that are traded across borders. So that's part of it. There was also a rapid rise in global supply chains that seems to be coming back a little bit. There's a repatriation of supply chains across national borders because it's a little bit more costly than firms had originally anticipated. So it's a combination of things. I don't think it's necessarily a worrisome development. Some people say it may be protectionism may be rising around the world. I don't think there's a huge amount of evidence that that's actually what's going on. I don't think it means an end of globalization, not even really a reversal of globalization, but I think world trade is changing a bit. And it's not just the big growth thing that it was in the past.
Since you're in the land of the Journal of Political Economy, so it's not just economics, not just politics. If you were advising Trump, and if he might be willing to at least listen to what you're saying, and he was focusing on rewarding his base, the marginal folks who pushed him over in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, are they all mostly these 50 to 55-year-old folks, do you think, and there's nothing much you could do other than maybe give them some money? Or would you advise him in anything in particular in those 3 states, those workers who he could say he's meeting the desires of his base and might help him get reelected?
Well, once again,
and also be good economics.
Right. I think the question is for the Rust Belt. And once again, it's not just Wisconsin, Michigan. It goes into Pennsylvania, Ohio. What can we do for this region of the country that will allow for reinvestment, not in old industries, but possibly new industries? And there I think it's going to be very difficult for the federal government to do a lot besides trying to provide investment tax credits or some special assistance for these regions. But once again, I wouldn't hold out any big hopes that it can reverse things very quickly because this has been going on for a long time. And there are a lot of deep structural trends that are affecting things here. So I hate to think of just writing checks or spending money in those districts. But whether their defense contracts can be shifted to certain regions or what have you, it's a difficult issue.
So, quick follow-up. He has Steve Moore, he has Art Laffer apparently as consultants to him or to his campaign. Mm-hmm. And those folks collectively have spent time at the Wall Street Journal, Heritage, University of Chicago. So I think they know what you're saying. What do you think they would say to you as to why they're not saying this to him or why he's not listening? Can you explain a little bit of that interaction, Trump with, or people close to Trump with people like Laffer and Steve Moore, and apparently why is this going on?
Well, I think one thing that they would point to is the need for corporate tax reform. And so that's something that is on the agenda, and we don't know exactly what form that will take. Is something the House is considering. But bringing down our relatively high rates with lots of exemptions, which are 35% or so, down to 20%. And then there's something called the border tax adjustment, which gets into the trade aspect of this a little bit. That's one way of increasing national investment. It's not targeted towards particular communities or the Rust Belt in particular that have been hard hit. But it would be a way, I think, of getting companies to invest more in the United States and provide those incentives. So that's something I think where the Trump administration, the gentleman you pointed to, Steve Moore and other people, where there could be a bipartisan consensus that would be a useful thing. Once again, it wouldn't be targeted necessarily towards depressed communities, but it would move things in the right direction. I think there's another hand. Yes?
My main questions are about trade deficits. So given that a lot of economic models sort of force trade balance, how do we really think about trade deficits in the context of economy? And why do you think there's been a sort of long-term trend in the U.S. of an increasing trade deficit? People have given a lot of sort of poor answers to how to fix it. What do you think of as being where we'll be in 30 years and why?
Well, partly this is the only safe asset in the world economy. So the U.S., there's a lot of demand, foreign demand for U.S. dollars, which means that every time we import something from abroad, they don't want to use this full value to buy U.S. products. They want to save some of it. We are the reserve currency of the world. We provide the world's safe asset. There's benefits to that and there are costs to that. One of the costs is that we've had a trade deficit that causes some problems for certain communities and a lot of political problems. So, but do we necessarily want to lose that? I mean, here's one way, if we want to get rid of the trade deficit, is for the president to say, you know what, maybe we won't pay our debts. Maybe we'll repudiate some federal government debt. What do you think foreign demand for dollars would do? Okay, people would start unloading it. The dollar would fall. And here's another sort of contradiction, is the president is trying to push the dollar down some sense, wants a weaker dollar to stimulate exports and discourage imports, but at the same time wants to speak about how the strong dollar is good for America because it's a reaffirmation of the foreign confidence in American economic policies. Well, you can't have both a strong dollar policy and a weak dollar policy. The French Prime Minister or Premier a number of years ago, I think it was Charles de Gaulle maybe even, said, the dollar, it's an exorbitant privilege that the United States is the only country that can sort of, provide this service to the world economy. We get away with so much. We don't have to worry about financing our trade deficits or things of that sort because it's almost sort of automatically financed because people want to hold dollars. It's an exorbitant privilege, but there's been some downsides to it as well. So whether there's a role for the IMF to try to think through what sort of arrangements will take place in the future, only time will tell. But in some sense, it takes a currency to beat a currency. And what's going to replace the dollar? Does anyone want to invest in Japanese yen? Does anyone want to invest in the euro? Does anyone want to invest in the Chinese renminbi? There's not a lot of confidence in those economic policies either. So the dollar is the currency of last resort. They might domestically, whether it affects international trade and capital flows across countries, that would be really hard to say. Well, it has a number of impacts. So first of all, we're not importing, because we're fracking and other things, we're not dependent on foreign oil nearly as much. I'm not sure what's happened to the positions of the big oil exports from the Middle East. To the extent that the world price of oil is lower, their current account their surpluses are going to be much lower because their income is going to be lower, and they've got to keep up consumption. When the world oil price was high, that's a time when they had huge trade surpluses because they were just earning so much in terms of export revenue that they couldn't spend it all in 1 year, so they were socking it away in dollars. So low price of oil probably works out well for the U.S. in terms of the current account balance because it diminishes their surpluses and eases our deficits. All right, well, I hope to see you tomorrow to talk more about whether trade policy can help remedy any of these problems we've talked about.